Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. This is Ukraine war. A sort of general geopolitical update. We are going to talk about Ukraine to some degree, but actually we're going to talk an awful lot about other things concerning the world at the moment, such as this continuing divorce between Europe and the US. Emmanuel Macron has come out and been very forthright in his positioning and where he thinks Europe should be and should go. We've got the head of the ECB saying, the European Central Bank, that is, saying that there should be all sorts of alternatives to, or there should at least be some alternatives to Visa, MasterCard, and the American-based payment system. So we are starting to see this divergence. And then you've had people like Marco Rubio coming out and talk about how places like Brazil are wanting to do trade deals with China in other currencies other than the dollar, and you're starting to see Emmanuel Macron talk about international trading alternatives, and that could be a serious problem for the US. So, this isn't just a case of people not getting on with each other. This is actually a destabilizing, or at least a shifting of locus of power and trade in the world away from the United States and the dollar, and that will have serious, or could have some very serious impacts on the United States. So it's a very interesting time in history. I want before we get into all that, I want to thank you guys for being here. I'm doing too many lives at the moment, and it's turning out to be one a day. But it's a chance for you guys to get together, have a chat with each other, and sort of discuss what's going on in the world through my lens. Unfortunately, for you guys, you're having to see things through, well, at least you're listening to my interpretation of what's going on, and I thank you for that. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the mods in advance, and thank you to those who have subscribed to the channel. If you haven't already done so, please remember to press that bell icon and subscribe to ATP Geopolitics. And I will thank you at least twice more for doing so. So thank you very much to the subscribers. So that's once already. Okay, awesome sauce. Let's get on with our daily geopolitical update. Now, I was halfway through this last night, and then I realized I hadn't taken my son to football training, so I had to run off mid-stream. We got to training 8 minutes late. I'm a very naughty man. This is what happens when you become completely obsessed with everything going on in the world, everywhere, all the time. That is where I'm at. Okay, we are going to start with Japan, of all things, and this is in the context of the Ukraine war. So let's get into that. We will bring up our source here saying Japan is set to join NATO's Pearl program. So that's the initiative to buy weapons for Ukraine from the United States to support Ukraine. However, they're not going to be buying weapons, unfortunately, although, like I've said before, two sides of a square. Reports indicate that Tokyo plans to participate in the US-NATO initiative that enables allied nations to fund critical US-made military equipment for Ukraine. According to NHK, the news source, Japanese news source, Japan will provide non-lethal equipment, including radar systems and body armor. Well, it's interesting that they go to the United States for body armor. I would have thought they could probably buy Japanese body armor. I don't know. I don't know whether the Pearl initiative is ideally, if you're Ukraine, you would want interceptors for Patriot from the US, stuff to do with F-16s, possibly radars, things that you can't get anywhere else. So it's interesting that Japan is using the Pearl system to buy body armor and non-lethal equipment, but radar systems definitely good. NATO members in Ukraine have already been informed of the plan. The move signals a further expansion of Japan's role in supporting Euro-Atlantic security efforts. So this is a very interesting move for them, because Ukraine and Russia is not wholly in Japan's sphere of influence, although it actually is with regard to particularly two things. The Kuril Islands north of Japan are contested, and the Russians contest them with, and have been contesting them with, Japan since the Second World War. But also China, like Japan's new, there's just this landslide election in Japan. I haven't really spoken about this too much, but basically, is it Takaichi, the new Japanese prime minister, who is a woman, but also really conservative, even though she's like a Metallica, she's like a metal fan, and she's just weird mix of everything. But she's super popular with the young. She's got a huge following on the socials, on Instagram and on Twitter. But she sees herself as a Margaret Thatcher. So she goes around with a handbag. Her handbag's so popular now that no one can buy it. It's like, it's in such high demand. But she is super conservative. And with that super conservatism, though, is, I think, a desire to, I guess, support the nationalist positioning of Japan locally, regionally. And the US will be seen as a really important ally here because they are pitting themselves against China and, of course, Russia just being next door as well. And so helping out Ukraine is a way of positioning themselves amongst allies in the Western world against the threat of China and Russia. So I think there's probably more to it here. But that landslide, I mean, together with another party, they would effectively, her party, Takaichi's party, and this other party, they would have a super majority. I mean, it's an absolute landslide victory for the Conservatives in Japan. So yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see what goes on with Japan going forward, because they have an issue with a growing population, and they're not replacing that with new births, but also with that strong conservatism is a desire not to see an influx of foreigners. So in fact, there had been recently relaxing of visas in Japan, if I remember correctly. Sorry, I'm just spitballing here. I wasn't planning on talking about Japan at all, but I think there was a relaxing of visas so that you get foreigners in. But Japan is, I'm probably being a bit harsh when I say sort of racist, but there are many people who say actually Japan is quite a, I mean, if you look over history, like with the Gaijin and whatnot, you have 400 years of closing itself off to the outside world. So it really hasn't been somewhere that has seen large influxes of migrants, right? Immigrants. Japan is not really somewhere where it's particularly hugely welcoming to the outsider, right? But the issue is this is a major economy, and like I've told you many times before, capitalism needs kind of perpetual growth. At the moment, we haven't developed an economic system that can rival capitalism, right? And capitalism just needs endless growth. So you've got broadly two options. Well, I suppose you've got three options. One option is the amount of people you got in your country, you just consume more. You just, like, everyone consumes more, and that's how you grow. But more realistically, you have more children, you grow the population essentially. So you either grow your consumption or you grow the population. And there are two ways you grow the population: one by having more babies, and two by having immigration. So I know we often talk about immigration in terms of social cohesion and the issues, like, throughout Europe, of not wanting outsider immigration, and same with the UK, and that's kind of what underwrote Brexit, and that's why there's a surge in the far right, or the right in Europe, across Europe, and in the United States. That is in tension with a desire to grow the economy. So you've had Pedro Sanchez recently in Spain say we're going to take on 500,000 migrants and kind of naturalize them type thing. And you had Angela Merkel taking on 800,000 people, Syrians and whatnot, back when she was in Germany. And you could make a case that actually it's not particularly about trying to be nice people and being all woke and lovely to immigrants, but actually it's an economic plan. It's a strategy to get more young people who are going to be net contributors. And actually, Cato Institute in the United States has just come out with some really interesting statistics to show that migrants are net contributors to the US in terms of tax and et cetera, although MAGA would tell you otherwise. Now this then puts economics up against kind of social cohesion and ideology, but essentially Japan, so to bring us back to Japan, if you are closing down your visa, so she's looking at then, making it harder for migrants to come into Japan, and they've got this aging population, then, I suppose you can just extend the working age, like the pension age just gets put back, but it's, you can only do that for so far. Do you really want a PE teacher to be like 69? Teaching your kids PE? Probably not. Okay, so we can't just keep extending the working age, or you have to be creative about that. But there will be an issue for Japan that they're going to have to deal with. So she's definitely got that as a challenge. Anyway, I wasn't planning on talking about Japan at all. In fact, I've just added this bit in last minute. So sorry to go off on one, but anyway, that's really good news to see Japan supporting Ukraine very overtly there. Right, we're going to go to Kaya Kallas, who's just been on, I guess is probably Euronews. Oh, it is Euronews. It's Europe Today program. A few things about Ukraine and Russia.
Well, we haven't seen Russia really taking the talk seriously because, while Ukraine already agreed to unconditional ceasefire over a year ago, then Russia keeps on bombing. I mean, just yesterday we heard how they're bombing civilian infrastructure all the time. Plus, they don't really have serious people, behind that table. So I don't expect anything out of this, really. Well, we haven't.
So yeah, not really hopeful with regard to peace coming from Russia.
Threats, ultimatums, use force, and then eventually there will always be people in the West who will offer you something so that you walk away with more than you had. And we have to keep this in mind because, the size of the Ukrainian army is not the problem because they haven't attacked Russia. The size of Russian army is a problem for all its neighbors. The size of Russian military budget is a problem for all. So we really need to see what kind of concessions are they willing to make. And just when it comes to threats, ultimately.
Yeah. So again, I think she's got her feet firmly planted on the ground. Kaya Kallas, and I'm a big fan of hers because I think she is one of the most, robust rhetorically, and indeed, in terms of what she would intend Europe to do rhetorically against Russia. She really understands Russia, and that's probably, being Estonian. But yeah, there you go. So she's I've got a lot of time for Kaya Kallas. Okay. So let's stay on the EU side of things. Ukraine could receive partial EU membership. We talked about this before, kind of two-tier membership. In fact, there are some saying that possibly plans ahead for like a 4-tier EU membership system. But partial EU membership as early as 2027, Politico reports a plan would allow Kyiv to take part in some EU decisions before completing all reforms, with full rights introduced gradually. The EU is also discussing ways to overcome Hungary's blocking position. That's been going on for years now, and they still haven't seemed to have come up with an issue with Hungary. And I guess they're just going to wait it out and hope that Peter Magyar gets elected. We've got a little bit more on Hungary later. The EU plans to impose sanctions for the first time on ports in third countries that service Russia's shadow fleet. Sky News is reporting the 20th sanctions package includes the ports of Kulevi in Georgia and Karamun in Indonesia, and may add banks from Laos, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. So sanctions packages looking further afield than just sort of Russia, looking at third parties there as well. So the European Union is preparing options to embed Ukraine's EU membership, going back to member status, into a future peace deal, according to Bloomberg. The plans include granting Ukraine early protection tied to accession and immediate access to some membership rights, according to people familiar with discussions. So it's not just about getting Ukraine into the EU for kind of economic reasons and political reasons. It's about that being part of a security architecture that protects Ukraine in the absence possibly of Article 5 from NATO or some kind of similar security guarantees arrangement. There will at least be some security guarantees for Ukraine if it's within the EU family. Macron, French President Emmanuel Macron, has called on the EU to resume dialogue with Russia without putting pressure on Ukraine. French President said that Paris has already resumed the channel of discussion at the technical level. He stressed that Europe's dialogue with Russia is necessary. Quote, and like, what's interesting here is I think this is as much about the US, and we're going to come on to all this talk that Macron is sort of coming out with at the moment that is very much pro EU, making a stance against the US. So having dialogue with Russia is possibly as much about taking control back from Trump's administration with regard to discussing the future for Ukraine. He said here, quote, would you like American ambassadors and representatives to negotiate the date of Ukraine's accession to the European Union on your behalf, on behalf of Europe? No, sorry, it's a matter of self-respect. So I think that is, yeah, we're going to, as I say, going to talk a lot about Macron, but I think he's really kind of taking the reins here, and probably thinking he'd like a lasting legacy, given that his tenure ends in 2027. In Kazakhstan, the Russian language has been secretly downgraded. The wording regarding the Russian language has been changed in the draft of Kazakhstan's new constitution. The draft of Kazakhstan's new constitution contains a subtle but fundamental change in the status of the Russian language, radically altering its position in the official sphere. The republic's authorities have decided to abandon the phrase of about the equal use of Russian with the state language, replacing it with the weaker phrase alongside. The linguistic reversal in the words 10, equal, and Qatar alongside in Article 9 of the Constitution effectively deprives the Russian language of parity in government organizations and local government bodies. Okay, that's a minor thing to discuss, but it's really important what is taking place in places like Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Kazakhstan. These are really important places that are the pathway from Asia into Europe, right? Into, say, Turkey, or into the Eurasian area, or this is the Eurasian area. And they have traditionally been either in the Soviet Union or in the Ruski Mir of late. And Russia appears to have lost Armenia and Azerbaijan. Macron has been courting with the Armenians, and this is going to be, that'll lead us on to our next point here. But Kazakhstan is making these subtle moves to get out of the sphere of influence of Russia. And then the choice is going to be sort of China or the West, or try and court both, because of course China is a big player in the region too. Okay, before we get on to Armenia, as I was mentioning, Georgia, another nation that's in this kind of neck of the woods. And I interviewed Marika Mikiashvili the other day. I advise you guys go and check out that interview. It's really, really positive. It was really interesting to speak to her, and you know, got a lot out of that. This is a great video. I'm not going to play you for the full 5 minutes here, but essentially you've got a Georgian coming in, and I love this. There's this element that Georgia is trying to get away from the Russian influence, but their government is holding them back. But from a kind of personal level, this is kind of what we often see. I mean, I've shown you videos like this before of Russians coming shopping in Georgian shops and being told what for by Georgians. Here is a Russian family that has come skiing, or like a pair that's come skiing, and she's proudly wearing her Russian flag patch on her shoulder, and she's told in no uncertain terms to take it off.
My friends, I just want to tell you that we are not happy to see Russian flags and Russian symbolics in our country, because our people, our soldiers, in our peaceful people are killed by the people who had these Russian writings on it. So please remove it, okay? Because we are not happy to have it.
And it goes on 5 minutes of this like long discussion between these two, and I just love that. I love the fact that there's some solidarity with Ukraine and against the Russian influence that is permeating in Georgia, as we've seen it permeate in Ukraine as well. So pushback there. Right, now sticking in this area, Armenia. So I was talking about how Macron has been to Armenia. They've got defense deals in place. The Brits have also put in is it Armenia or Azerbaijan? I can't remember. The Brits have we've got some kind of strategic agreement. I think it might be Azerbaijan, but it could be Armenia. Anyway, Armenia was the nation that was most kind of supported by Russia in the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh, and the Armenians have been the ones that actually have most eschewed Russian influence, and they've gone to France to say, hey, can we hang out together? And France has been very quick. Like Macron has gone to Armenia. Well, it's very interesting now, and then given the context of what we're going to talk about with regard to Macron and saying that Europe needs to move away from the United States. The United States here, and for good reason, has gone into bed with Armenia. We've got JD Vance here in Armenia. A very important geopolitical event, says Gerashenko. Congratulations to the great geostrategist Putin. The United States signed a civil nuclear cooperation agreement with Armenia, pledging as much as $9 billion in potential investment as the South Caucasus country seeks to reduce its dependence on long-standing reliance on Russian energy. According to Bloomberg, the document provides US companies with access to export nuclear technology, fuel, and services. It also allows the United States to compete for a deal to replace the Soviet-era Metsamor nuclear power plant, which currently supplies about 40% of the country's electricity with small modular reactors. Quote, it'll pave way for American and Armenian companies to strike deals on civil nuclear projects. That means up to $5 billion in initial US exports, plus an additional $4 billion in long-term support through fuel and maintenance contracts. This is a classic win-win for both Armenia and the United States of America. It means stronger energy security for my own country, stronger energy security for Armenia, and it's also going to create a lot of new jobs, said US Vice President JD Vance at a briefing in Yerevan. Now, this is very clever of the United States, and it is sensible for them to try and do this, because otherwise Rosatom, the Russian Atomic Energy Agency, would be straight in there trying to provide their own nuclear services to Armenia. And I think this is so important to get these countries, these satellite nations, to Russia on side. And of course, this is the sort of activity that in another context would start a war, right? It's the idea that, you know, John McCain was going to Ukraine on the borders of Russia and doing all the stuff back in 2013, 2014, and Victoria Nuland, and you had all this narrative from the Russians, and we don't want NATO on our doorsteps. It's not like Armenia is going to join NATO here, but this is this could be seen as escalatory to the Russians. I mean, it won't be, because they are simply losing power in the region. But anyway, I think that's important. Okay, this is great. A civil flight from Russia to Cuba. Cuba is a holiday destination for Russians, as with many people around the world. But of course, there are the connections of Cuba to Russia, Cuba to Venezuela, Venezuela to Russia. That's how effed up it is. Russians really wanted to, but couldn't fly to Cuba. The flight was turned back from the runway with the engines already running. Today, Russia's ally, Cuba, admitted it has nothing left to refuel aircraft. Cuba has run out of jet fuel. So what the Cubans are saying now is that you can only fly to Cuba if you've got enough fuel to fly back, right, to wherever you came from, or fly on to somewhere else. So if you're flying from Russia, you're going to refuel in Cuba, then you fly back to Russia. Can't do that anymore. So they've now, just as they got onto the plane, they just found out that Cuba's run out of jet fuel. Why has it run out of jet fuel? Well, because the United States is now stopping oil going from Venezuela to Cuba. And this is one of the things that happened as a result of kidnapping Maduro, is that they could control. And I was saying Cuba could be one of the next places, because they're going to be starved of energy, essentially. If you're starved of energy, you know, you're going to struggle to get your petrol, you know, your gasoline, your diesel, your aviation fuel. The country comes to something of a standstill. And that is due to what the United States is doing with Venezuela. And then you stop getting tourist dollars, or tourist rubles in this case, from abroad, because you can't fly into Cuba because you can't fly out. This is a really serious thing. So I think that's a fascinating development there. Now, Newsmax, a conservative US network launching Ukraine news, is launching a Ukraine news channel. The media company, founded by Chris Ruddy, a close ally of President Trump, will open a full-fledged editorial office in Ukraine to produce local and regional news content. Now, this is a big, I think, a big problem. You've had an argument from people like, oh, I meant to have it here. So Megan Mobbs, Keith Kellogg's daughter, who works in Kiev, has been having a go at people talking about this as being a bad thing. People like Constantine, Andrew Perpetua, talking about this being a bad thing, saying, look, you know, this is really good. You've got blah, 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 blah. But we've also had news, and we'd heard this previously, that the Trump administration has been talking to opposition leaders in Ukraine. So this is where the Trump administration is trying to influence the political outcome of future elections in Ukraine. They want to support people like Tymoshenko and other, although she's now in trouble with the scandal. But the US administration is very much getting involved with supporting opposition leaders to Zelensky. Now, there is a theory here that since Chris Ruddy is such a close ally of Trump, why would he want to set up a news media organization, a news channel in Ukraine? What a bizarre place to suddenly decide to set up a news channel, unless there's a bigger play at foot here, whereby that news channel will be a vehicle to sow propaganda for opposition leaders in Ukraine. I mean, this is a pretty in my books, pretty controversial. And people like Megan Mobbs are not seeing straight when they're trying to defend this kind of decision. You know, it is going to be yet more propaganda. Newsmax, you know, is I would argue that Newsmax, being in Ukraine, Newsmax is a pretty poisonous news entity in my books. Absolutely not a fan of it, especially is it not it's either Newsmax or OAN. I think it's Newsmax, where Matt Gaetz is an anchor, and you're thinking Matt Gaetz is a thoroughly bad human being. Like, if that's your moral choice, then yeah, I'm not sure that we should be listening to Newsmax. But yeah, that's a real MAGA. It's even more MAGA than Fox News news channel deciding to set up in Ukraine. I just think surely they're going to be wondering whether they should give a license to Newsmax. But then they'll get accused of censorship and no free press, and so it's a no-win situation. This week, a Ukrainian delegation led by Zelensky will arrive in Germany for the Munich Security Conference. Ukraine, says Ukraine Context. Plans include meetings with Marco Rubio and members of the US Congress. The main topic of the talks is the schedule for signing security guarantees and their subsequent ratification by Congress. Last year at the Munich Security Conference, if you remember, JD Vance came over and slagged off Europe and said the West's biggest threat isn't from Russia, it's from freedom of speech constraints in Europe, so on and so forth. So it's going to be absolutely fascinating to see what the Munich Security Conference looks like this year. Now, just a little bit of European election news here. We've talked about Japan's election success, some pretty decent electoral success for the left wing in Portugal against the far right. The Chega right-wing candidate André Ventura got 33.18% of the vote. Antonio José Seguro got 66.82% of the vote. The Socialist Party as candidate has been elected as president of Portugal. And a lot of people saying, you know, this is a great thing for, you know, democracy, and it's keeping the far right out of a really important country in Europe. European Democrats here saying exit polls have no room for doubt. Antonio José Seguro is on track to become Portugal's next president, blah, 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 decisively defeating the far-right candidate André Ventura. Beyond the numbers, this is a political message for the whole of Europe. Once again, after Romania and the Netherlands, a moderate pro-European candidate prevails over a Trump-inspired populist right. The dark tide of the far right is not inevitable. It can be stopped when democratic responsibility and European values are defended without hesitation, and when politics delivers real answers to citizens. Okay, all that aside, the reality is you've still got a third of the national vote going to the far right. Now, Chega are a little bit more, I think, complex. I've probably got a couple of Portuguese viewers here, hopefully. I think Chega aren't classically far right in the way that, say, AFD are, and like super in bed with Russia. Chega, I think, support Ukraine still. So I think it is a little bit funkier in Portugal, maybe. But Portugal does have quite an interesting political history. You know, for example, they socially they've decriminalized drugs in Portugal, and that's deemed as something of a success, or it's often held up as the data point to suggest decriminalizing drugs elsewhere and seeing it more as a health issue. Although, I mean, that's a whole other discussion, and some people actually point to the fact that some of the data in Portugal, you can make an argument that was not a good decision. But anyway, it's really interesting. If you want to watch a really good documentary, it's probably still on Netflix. It's a few years old now. Won an Oscar, I think. It's called The 13th, and the 13th Amendment is the kind of slavery amendment in the U.S. Constitution. And the 13th, as a documentary, is the documentary maker of that film went on to make Central Park 5, the documentary about Central Park 5. What's it called? I'm sure someone will tell me what it's. It's like a 5-part series about the Central Park 5, those 5 young black kids who were wrongly accused of I think raping in Central Park, and they went down for it, and it's astonishingly well made drama. I think is drama, dramatization of that. But anyway, she also made the 13th, and 13th looks at the decision back in whenever it was, 50s, 60s. You know, you're mapping it through Jim Crow era laws and whatnot, and you're looking at segregation and racism in the United States, and then seeing the decision to make drugs a criminal problem and not a health problem was part of the kind of possibly the Southern strategy, maybe, but it was certainly this idea, that an intentional idea to disenfranchise Black Americans in terms of voting, because if you criminalize a large, a subsection of society like drug takers, who are disproportionately coming from Black communities at the time, and probably still so now, then if you're criminalizing that rather than saying it's a health problem, it's an addiction problem, we should treat it as a mental health issue or it's a physical health issue, you're saying it's a criminal issue, then suddenly you're putting lots of people in prison. And the American laws have generally historically been, if you go to prison, then you can't vote. And even when you come out of prison, you can't vote. Then you've suddenly disenfranchised a load of people. And if those people are disproportionately Black, and if Black people are disproportionately more likely to vote Democrat, then the decision to criminalize drugs ends up being a political decision to disenfranchise a bunch of people so that they can't vote for Democrats. So it's really interesting there. So the whole idea about decriminalizing drugs or criminalizing drugs is a huge, can have a huge political dimension to it, and it's not just a kind of social decision. Anyway, if you get a chance to watch the 13th, a very good documentary. It's a few years old now. Yeah, so Sarah World says, although I need to look at the data, yes, drug is a health issue and people are helped to treat it. They do it in Portugal and it's been working. At least there are some stats to suggest it's been working. I think it depends how I'm sure you can cherry pick your stats either way. Now, moving on to Romania. In case you were wondering, says Adrian P., why so many non-Romanian accounts are suddenly promoting pro-Russian candidate and traitor to Romania, Călin Georgescu, so the guy that ran for president, and then the presidential elections got cancelled because he was backed by Russia, and then they got rerun again, and that partly what people like J.D. Vance and the MAGA right in the US have been going on about, how Europe is undemocratic because they cancelled this election. Well, they cancelled that election because of the outright Russian influence and money and propaganda. Incidentally, the same people downplaying MAGA and Russia's heavy involvement in Epstein. So $800,000 for Mario Norfal. So Mario Norfal is this right wing. I think Jonathan Fink has debated Mario Norfal online, but Mario Norfal, this guy on Twitter who is a massive influencer in the MAGA Elon Musk sphere, was paid $800,000 to support Karlin Georgescu. Dan Andronic has announced the money would have been delivered by the AUR. So that needs to be looked at. I mean, goodness me, the money going from Russia into Europe to disrupt our political systems and elections is quite astonishing. Now let's go to Czechia. Shabalix Pani here says Prime Minister Andrej Babiš's Fresh coalition faces mass protests after his foreign minister allegedly tried to blackmail President Petr Pavel. So I've already reported on this. There's big protests, or wasn't so much in protest as in support of Petr Pavel. Babiš is hit by scandals, cabinet clashes, and chaotic foreign policy. I would be interested from my Czech viewers out there, and of course we're all biased, so I'll take whatever you say with a pinch of salt. You might have a certain political persuasion, but I'd be genuinely interested to see how well received the Babiš coalition is by everyday Czechs, whether they are delivering on what they've promised or whether they are really too divisive. They're certainly not supportive of Ukraine, but whether the people who voted them in are happy with what they're doing, so on and so forth. If we take a step across to Hungary, we can see that it's all hotting up ready for the April elections there. Quote, again, Shabalix Pani saying, quote, and this is coming from Peter Magyar, the opposition candidate for prime minister. Hungary's opposition Tisza party plans to introduce a wealth tax for the rich, adopt the euro currency, because at the moment they have Hungarian florins there, and firmly anchor Hungary in the European Union and NATO. Its 240-page election program has been published on Saturday, said that. So that is huge, right? They are the opposition, which is still doing really well in the polls, is firmly placing themselves in the pro-Europe, even taking on the euro, and taxing the rich. Now, that will be very much a position against Orban. Orban has grifted. His family have grifted. They've become billionaires by essentially grifting off European EU money. So that kind of wealth tax is, I think, a statement against the political elites as much as the economic elites there, but then saying we are going to take on the euro. What Peter Magyar has going for him is if he goes the full pro-EU direction, what will happen? Because at the moment he can very, very justifiably say that Orban's been terrible for the country because we're now the most corrupt country in the EU with the worst performing economy or thereabouts. So Orban has failed. And if we go full on into a pro-EU stance, then the EU will, if we jump through a bunch of hoops, then we will have all the frozen money that the EU has frozen that should be going to Viktor Orban's, well, it should be going to Hungary. It's been frozen because Viktor Orban democratically backslid. If Peter Magyar then completely embraces the EU, then they'll get that money back. And there already is an economic stimulus from the EU. There's a whole bunch of money owed to Hungary that they're not getting because they've been naughty boys and girls. If they get that money back, then that is Peter Magyar already taking in a whole bunch of money that you can use to support your welfare system, to support your economy, to stimulate that economic growth to take Hungary forward. So there's a really good opportunity for Magyar to embrace the EU and actually get some financial benefit out of so doing. Now, actually, could be worth saying, I'm going to bring this before I go to NATO. I'm going to talk about this. So talking about the elections in Hungary, it's very clear what the US is trying to do. Marco Rubio is heading to Budapest and Bratislava after the Munich Security Conference. It's not quite JD Vance meeting Alice Weidel after the Munich Security Conference last year and not meeting Olaf Scholz. So getting into bed with the far right in Germany, but it's not far off. So Rubio going to Bratislava, which is Slovakia, to no doubt meet with Robert Fico and the right-wing coalition there. You've got Rubio going to Budapest to meet with Viktor Orban because Donald Trump has formally endorsed Viktor Orban in that election. Jay and Kiev says Vance headed again to court Europe's Russian-backed far right. Saving Orban is now job number one for the Trump Europe policy. So the Trumpian national security strategy, remember, was one that formally endorsed the we're proud to support. I forget the terminology, but it was the partisan nationalist. I forget the terminology, but essentially the national security strategy says, we are going to endorse the far right in Europe, and brackets in order to disunite the EU, right? And now it looks like Marco Rubio is going to be the boy that's going out to Budapest to bat for Viktor Orban and Fidesz. But I just think that Trump probably needs to read the tea leaves there, because unless Orban is going to cheat, in which case there's going to be some massive ramifications for that from the EU, and they'll be kicked out of the EU. But then you'll have massive protests on your hands. I really think that Orban's in a very difficult place here because he's not going to win the popular vote. I'm sure that's just not going to happen unless some miracle happens between now and April. He's not going to win the popular vote. And his only choice then, if he's adamant he's going to keep hold on to power, is to cheat and rig. But the US is getting involved, and maybe the US is going to do what they did with Argentina. So the US in Argentina says, well, we've got $40 billion coming your way, Argentina. But if Javier Milei's party is not voted through in these senatorial elections, then in the Senate elections, then you're not going to get that $40 billion. So the US bribed Argentinian voters in the last election with $40 billion. And it's that simple. I mean, if that's not political interference, I don't know what is. And the stuff that Trump is doing, it's all out in the open. And whether the US used to do that, but just under the radar, that's an interesting conversation to have. But they're doing it out in the open now. It's like, yeah, don't really care what you call it. You can call it interference, you can call it illegal, but we're doing it. Don't really care. Oh, and we're going to kidnap a leader from another country and we're going to nick their oil. Bothered? No, not really. Whatever. We're more powerful than you, so I don't really care. And the UN seems to be somewhat toothless to do anything about it. And now the US is, I would have thought, going to go into Budapest and say, what can we do to make sure that Viktor Orban remains in charge? Because that's what Steve Bannon wants. And Donald Trump wants it because Steve Bannon's whispering in his ear and has, informed him over the years that that's the way forward. Now, if this is confirmed, this is very significant. We're hearing that the US is looking to back out of several NATO commands under a new plan. So this is a case of the Trump administration pulling back from NATO and giving power to the Europeans. Now, this is interesting because, that's kind of good for NATO. It depends which way you're looking at this. Like, it's better for NATO if it's not just an American toy whereby they get to dictate what everyone else in NATO does, and they say jump and we say how high, and they say this is what your foreign policy should be, and everyone says okay, and it is just NATO is an arm of the US's foreign policy diplomacy. But if they're kind of pull back from that and say, well, Europe needs to step up, then that's good for Europe. We get more sovereignty over NATO. But it's kind of, if you're an American that thinks that NATO should be an American toy or it should be an American tool, then actually the US is giving up power here and is giving up say. And I think this is just a start of a gradual incremental decrease in the US being part of NATO, and eventually they'll be out of NATO. That would be the kind of MAGA isolationist or kind of imperialist, it's both isolationist and expansionist, is essentially the US kind of wants to pull out, or the Trump administration wants to pull out of NATO so that they can just decide things on their own, and they see themselves as powerful enough to do things on their own in their own neck of the woods. So if we want to take Greenland, we're not in NATO anymore. We're going to have Greenland, and it doesn't matter what Denmark says, we're going to have it. And NATO can say what they like, but even all the European and Canadian forces in NATO, they're not going to match us in the US. So we'll have Greenland, we'll have Canada, we'll have Venezuela, and we'll have Mexico, and then you've got the Monroe Doctrine. And is this the start of that? Am I overselling this, right? So lots of people talking about this. Here we have historic milestone for NATO. On February the 6th, allies agreed on a new distribution of senior officer responsibilities, with European allies, including new members, to play a stronger role in the alliance's military leadership, and the US is to confirm strong commitment to NATO, though still. Special thanks to all the CHODs for their constructive and responsible approach throughout this vital journey, yada, yada, yada. So things are changing. Greg Bagwell says this is a significant and good news for NATO. US officers are dominated in the command and staff structure. This looks like a redistribution of posts to more non-US individuals with greater influence within the organization. It will also support higher spending for non-US nations. So this could end up being really a win-win for everyone involved. Or it could also be an excuse for the US to start extracting themselves from this security architecture. Who knows? We'll have to see. Oh, Betty's in the live chat, which then brings us on to the core of this video. And I know I've done an awful lot of talking. There's just so much to talk about. Trump has attacked Europe again, right? Trump randomly decides to mock Europeans again. All these European leaders in the White House, Trump saying that Canada and I guess Greenland, they are all part of the United States, right? And then he's tweeting that, right? So this is like, okay, it's one of his staffers. Well, who knows these days? You had the whole situation previously about that racist meme or that racist video that he played, and you're like, he kind of says, oh, it's a staffer that did this and yada yada yada. But it's functionally the same, right? Like this is he is advocating for US dominance in Canada and Greenland, and he's doing that as a statement of, from a position of power, as you can see on the left, sitting in the seat, all the European leaders facing him like a lesson, like they're children, and this is a father figure, and he's just saying, and this is how it is. So there is a mockingness going on there, and we're going to use that as a kind of a springboard into the next section and look at what Macron is saying, kind of not quite in response to that, but in response to that sense that he's getting from Trump. Just going to have a look at some super chats and whatnot. Yuri Kraus from Czechia saying people don't hate the far right enough. Orban has to go. I don't disagree with that, Yuri. You and I, we could share a beer and talk it over. Stephen Bendal. Thanks, matey. All who is endorsed by Trump in the US are losing. Why should there not be that outcome in Europe too? Yeah, there's just this flux, and there's just a lot of influence to do with, I think, Russian influence, American influence in Europe, Chinese, Iranian, North Korean influence through bots and troll farms. The issue of immigration is pertinent in the US, but what they did is went too far. And Trump with ICE is now you've got to a position in the US where like a lot of people are pushing back against ICE. ICE is becoming less and less popular, and so there is just, he has strategically, like if I was Susie Wiles, I'd be pulling my hair out. Like Trump has just done. He's essentially just listened to everything Stephen Miller has said. And Stephen Miller has influenced him enough that he's just made bonkers decisions. Like strategically, they should have supported Ukraine. They would have lost nothing by supporting Ukraine. All of the MAGA Republicans would have come around. The Reagan Republicans would have massively supported that approach. And so then suddenly you've got Republican-leaning independents still supporting Trump. But he just goes he goes right in to support Russia. Everything is to support Russia. Now, there may be compromise, there may be other reasons for that, but strategically, I think that was a poor choice. And then, you can be robust on immigration without becoming fascistic, but they've become fascistic, and you've got armed ICE and CBP operatives just taking people off the streets and disappearing them. I've got even more videos I can show you that are just absolutely horrific. That's all still going on. Tariffs and the trade war on everyone, picking fights with all your allies, but not with China and Russia. It just doesn't go over well. It's just a tough sell. So all of these decisions he's making, they're just strategically stupid. It's not that like I'm not trying to have a go at Trump because I don't like Trump. That is true. I don't like him. But just like, those are stupid decisions, irrespective of who you are. So I just think strategically he's been really naive, and he's just trying to create an almost like fascistic government there. It's too far too quick, and now he's lost all the independents, pretty much all of the Democrats for sure, and then some of his own. When you start seeing, like I said the other day, when you start seeing some of the polling results in special elections, like in Texas in the 9th special district, where Kemet just won. He won, what was it? I don't know, 57% or whatever. But in order to get that number, he had to have had Republicans voting for him. So Trump is losing Republicans in Texas in special elections. They are being persuaded to vote for Democrats. If you've got to that stage, you've made some strategic blunders, and Trump has made some strategic blunders. Yeah. So, yeah. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share. Thank you, Ronnie, for reminding us all that is, of course, a great idea. And just a few comments before we go on to this next section. Lucky Strike says, I just hope in a few years we can laugh at how mad the 2020s were and it's all back to normal. Honestly, I wonder whether we just think we've been in some crazy fever dream. In 2030, do we look back and go, that was nuts? Did that happen? Did that really happen? Were we there? Were we there when that happened? Oh, that's crazy. Doodle Pimp says the EU needs to learn to call Trump's bluffs more. He folds easily. The trade deal the EU made with him previously sold out too much. Yes and no. So I did part of my, you might not have seen it, Doodle Pimp, but I did a live stream recently where there was some people discussing actually how successful the EU have been in terms of standing up to Trump, but by doing it not overtly, right? And it seems like the position the EU has taken, which is try and appease him in public, say, say blah, 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 blah. But then in private, they go and do deals with Canada, do deals with the UK, and do deals with China, and then Indonesia and Vietnam. And they're going all over the world, the EU at the moment, and sewing up some pretty decent trade deals. And what you're seeing is a movement away from the US hegemonic status quo, and they're shifting, and that's what we're going to go on and talk about now. But actually, Macron is starting to be a bit more robust in his rhetoric, like kind of Doodle Pimp is asking for. But actually, the EU hasn't made Trump go nuts at the EU by standing up strong and making him fold, because actually he's retributive. So he holds a grudge. He will hate the EU for that. He already doesn't like the EU. And so there is an argument to say this softly approach has actually been a successful approach to the EU, and they've actually got away without the US. I mean, goodness me, what a world we live in that you can kind of half expect Trump's America to go to economic and political war with the EU, with Europe. But that hasn't happened, largely, arguably, because of the positioning of Europe in that context. Okay. Right, we're just going to go on to the next bit, but I'm going to read out Benny Pie. What do you have to say? Was late to the live as my daughter came home from school. Pa, does JP have videos on Epstein? And I had to tell her all the theories before she had taken her coat off. She now has lots to watch on ATP. Oh my goodness, you're good on you, Benny, for that education, and welcome to your daughter to ATP Geopolitics. You should remind me of her name again, and I'll give her a special hello. That sounds a bit dodgy. Special hello. Right, let's go to the core of this video, which is French President Emmanuel Macron. We're going to start with Macron, go to more European positions, and then come back to Macron. But remember, the context here is that the US looks to be sort of mocking Europe and not mocking Russia and not mocking China. You have never seen Trump mock Putin. You have never seen Trump mock Xi Jinping. But you have seen Trump mock European leaders, and he even mocks Emmanuel Macron. He does the impression of him at his rallies recently. That's something he started doing, taking the mickey out of Macron and belittling him and so on and so forth. I think Macron's probably had enough, and we're starting to see some pushback. So French President Macron has publicly warned that the administration of the US president and of the US President Donald Trump is openly anti-European. So he's now saying that the United States is openly anti-European and has accused it of seeking the dismemberment of the European Union. Macron said this reflects deeper tensions over issues like Greenland, trade policy, and digital regulation, and he urged EU leaders to stand firm rather than compromise. He called on European governments to use what he termed, quote, the Greenland moment, and this is in a Reuters article that we'll look at later, as a wake-up call to strengthen the bloc's economic resilience and global influence in the face of pressure from both the United States and China. Okay, so let's have a look. Let's look at this a bit more. French President in El País, the Spanish news outlet, said the strategy of bowing down to the United States does not work. If Europe does not decide for itself, others will decide in its place. And that goes back to what we were saying earlier. We were talking about earlier where Macron, is saying that we need to be talking with Putin because otherwise the US is going to do it on our behalf. And the US isn't going to have the Europe's best interests at heart. So first thing to note, just in terms of Europe, Poland's GDP is now, its export value is now higher than Russia's. Think of all those Russian oil and gas exports. Obviously, they've been hit recently. Poland is a big player on the world economic stage nowadays. In fact, when you look at, was it 2004, Poland and Greece had about the same GDP. And now in 2026, Poland's GDP is like 4 times Greece's. Incredible success story, Poland, and largely down to its place in the European Union and the money and the stimulus and the single market and all those things that allow someone like Poland to flourish. Without the EU, Poland wouldn't flourish, which is kind of frustrating that you get people like the Law and Justice Party and the Confederation who are Eurosceptic, want to take Poland away from the EU. And like, that's part of why you're at where you're at now, or largely why you're at where you're at. With Russia's oil exports collapsing and Poland's economy booming, a major shift has occurred. Poland has overtaken Russia in total export value. I just thought I'd throw that in because there's a few things to say with regard to Poland. Now, the FSB reported the involvement of Polish intelligence services in the assassination attempt on General Alexeyev. So I think it's never good news when Russia overstretches and starts accusing countries like, in this case, Poland, of doing things against Russia, because it then just pushes Poland away from the Russian sphere of influence. So then you'll have people like Confederation going, well, okay, Russia are being gits to us. And so, do you know what I mean? Like these are countries in Eastern Europe that you want to be kind of trying to nurture that relationship. You want to nurture so that, you know, you can get influence in, you know, Romania, in Hungary, in Poland, so that they remain in the, or come over to the Russian sphere of influence. By just blaming Poland here for certain things, then you're pushing Poland away. So anyway, I thought that was interesting. But really, in terms of the relationship between Europe and the United States, we talked previously about Thomas Rose, the ambassador, US ambassador to Poland, who then started this massive argument by taking out on a social democrat in Poland who had said, we're not going to nominate Donald Trump, said a few things, you know, that Rose thought was just a massive insult to Trump. And then he went on a tirade against this guy, and then it started a diplomatic ruckus. Now, US Ambassador Thomas Rose in Rzeczpospolita today, in his first interview after severing contact with the same speaker. So this Vladimir Krzyzewski 50 is the Speaker of the Parliament for allegedly insulting Donald Trump. So the question from this outlet, the Speaker said President Trump does not deserve the Nobel Peace Prize. You called this scandalous insults. And Rose answers, that was not everything he said. Anyone can read it again. I've said enough. We will not accept or tolerate scandalous insults against our president. Every Pole has a right to express their opinions, but we also have the right to respond. Question, which part of the Speaker's remarks constituted a personal attack? Answer, you can ask me the same question 25 times and you will get the same answer. So he's refusing to get involved here, refusing to justify his own response in calling these scandalous kind of insults, personal insults, except they weren't really that. And then last question, the US maintains relations with far more controversial figures, including Vladimir Putin. How do you explain this? It's a bloody great question. He answers, I do not have to explain that. Well, okay, thanks for not answering there. But anyway, you know, there's this ruckus between Poland and the US, where Poland has been seen as this really robust supporter of the US in times gone past, and even that relationship is becoming fractured. Polish Lieutenant General Piotr Bladzius says Poland is actively planning for scenarios where the US does not come to help. You always need a main plan and branch plans. You don't discuss the details, but you always have different plans shelved. Translation, if even the Poles don't rely on the US as an ally, literally no one does. So, like, without wanting, I'm not trying to be anti-US here, by the way. I guess I'm anti-Trump, right, and his administration, because I think he's ruining relationships with the US that the US will need going forward. But what I'm trying to say is, look, here's a reality of what's going on in Europe. You've got Macron and others in Europe saying, right, we need to go it alone, or we need to rely on ourselves and not the US. You've got Poland saying that, and you've got Poland wargaming scenarios where the US doesn't come in the invocation of Article 5. We need to have things in place. So the US is being seen as an unreliable ally to Europe, and there's a lot of pushback. No matter which government rules the country, all European nations share a common dislike for Putin, even in Hungary, all but one, Serbia. Remember this, whenever Serbia makes a call for entering the EU, they're literally Putin's only fans. So at the same time, there's this general dislike for Putin, as you should expect in Europe, and yet Serbia is still not the case there. Putin is universally disliked across Europe, right? And you're starting to get a similar situation where the US is becoming disliked, or at least Trump is becoming disliked. And that's this funny situation where, from a European viewpoint, you're starting to put Trump and Putin together in the same box. And then you've probably got Trump going, well, actually, that's fine, because I want to do $12 trillion of trade with Russia. And we've got the Dmitriev package that we can do, and we're going to talk about that in a little while. In fact, I might bring that into play. Anyway, we'll come to that later, because there's a lot of grifting going on there. Anyway, since Donald Trump returned to the White House, the Swedish people's view of the US has deteriorated sharply, according to a new survey. Only 7% of Swedes say they have a positive view of the US. 7%, 93% of Swedes do not have a positive view of the US. What the hell has happened? So Trump is pushing people away, pushing European nations away from him, and they are rejecting Trump, and by extension the United States. And the poor American viewers of this video, who are like decent people, thinking, what have I done wrong? Well, no, you haven't, unless you voted for Trump. But you know, this is what happens when you have this populist wingnut in charge of your country. Only 4% say they have a positive view of Trump. The only less popular figure in Sweden is Putin, right? Then you've got this. Nearly 2/3 of Germans now see the US as a serious threat to world peace. 65% of Germans, which is up from 46% last year. So in just 1 year, you've got like a 20% increase, per the Allensbach survey cited by DW, of Germans who see the US as a serious threat to world peace. In 2024, just 24% viewed the US as a threat to world peace. So it's gone from 24% to 46% to 65%. Why? Donald Trump. I'm sorry, that's that. Russia remains number one at 81%, biggest threat to world peace. China at 46%. China is seen as less, by 20% almost, less of a threat to world peace than the United States in Germany. So then we have this scenario where, and I've talked about this before, the European Union countries are looking at alternatives to US tech. Nowhere is this as important, maybe, as in the payment domain, because the US has a near monopoly there. The EU has called for urgent creation of alternatives to Visa and MasterCard to reduce dependence on the US. According to Director General of the EU Banking Alliance, the dominance of the US payment systems is a potential leverage point should transatlantic relations deteriorate. So the fact that everyone's talking about this means that there are problems, right? European alternatives to Visa and MasterCard are urgently needed, according to Christian Lagarde. As the Financial Times notes, Visa and MasterCard currently account for approximately 2/3 of card transactions in the Eurozone, while 13 EU countries lack a national alternative. The 2024 EPI launched Wero in 2024, a European alternative to Apple Pay. It currently has approximately 48.5 million users. The EU is also discussing a digital euro as a possible basis for a pan-European payments system, but it may come too late after Donald Trump's current presidential term ends. So that's all pretty interesting. Macron, going back to Macron, he's warned of the renewed friction with the US and urges the US to use this Greenland moment to push reforms. This is we've already quoted from this article. But Europe should brace for more moments of US hostility, French President Macron has warned, and should treat what he called the Greenland moment as a wake-up call to push through long-delayed reforms to strengthen the bloc's global power. In an interview with several European newspapers, a French leader said the European Union should not mistake a lull in tensions with Washington for a lasting shift, despite a pause in the US threats over Greenland, trade and technology. Macron urged EU leaders to use a summit in a Belgian castle this week to inject fresh energy into economic reforms to bolster the bloc's competitiveness and strengthen its ability to stand up to China and the US at the world stage. Quote, when there's a clear act of aggression, I think what we should do isn't bow down or try to reach a settlement, Macron told Le Monde, the Financial Times and other newspapers in comments published on Tuesday. We've tried that strategy for months. It's not working. Macron said the Trump administration was being openly anti-European and seeking the EU's dismemberment. He said he anticipated further tensions with Trump administration, including over Europe's regulation of digital technology. So like I've said before, American foreign policy is really an extension of the strategic digital sector's marketing strategy. Macron here in Bloomberg says Europe needs to stand up to Trump on trade and tech. The US will, in the coming months, that's certain, attack us over digital regulation. Macron added that Spain and France may be targeted over their proposed social media bans for children. The EU and several governments across Europe, including UK, Portugal, Denmark, Greece, Norway, Poland, Austria, Ireland, and the Netherlands, are also weighing such measures, and they would impact companies like Meta, Facebook, Instagram, Snap Inc., like Snapchat, Elon Musk's X, TikTok, and Google's YouTube. A ban in Europe would cut off access to millions of young users from services regulators call harmful and addictive, so on and so forth. So, there is that element to what's going on as well. Now, TLDR News, this is a pretty useful video, explained how France is actively ditching US tech and how a growing list of EU countries are taking concrete steps, from dropping Zoom and Microsoft tools to blocking strategic sales to reduce dependence on American digital platforms and build European digital sovereignty. France ditched Zoom and Microsoft Teams in government and public administration, replacing it with a French video conferencing solution called Visio. France plans to move away from Microsoft Office and Google Workspace toward a domestic productivity suite. French authorities raided X's Paris office as a part of an enforcement actions against unlawful data scraping and algorithmic practices. France blocked the sale of the Eutelsat ground antenna to protect European satellite and digital infrastructure from foreign control. That was interesting. I didn't know that. So Eutelsat and OneWeb, this response or alternative to SpaceX and Starlink, they were going to sell the antenna off, obviously, to some foreign non-European entity, and they put their foot down and said, no, that can't be sold. for national security reasons. Austria's military has dropped Microsoft Office in favor of non-US alternatives. German state of Schleswig-Holstein migrated about 40,000 public employees off Microsoft Exchange and Outlook to open source systems. European Parliament resolution urging public procurement preference for European digital products and services is taking place. EU is pushing for an EU Cloud and AI Development Act to create independent European cloud and AI infrastructure, and calls by EU leaders, Macron, Draghi, von der Leyen, for massive investment in sovereign technologies like AI, quantum, and cloud computing. These steps reflect a shift from passive regulation of tech platforms to active substitution, enforcement, and strategic diversification away from US technology providers. Okay, so this is not just kind of rhetoric, it's not just politicking. There is tangible effect on procurement and industry. Now, Emmanuel Macron has also called for future-oriented euro bonds to finance strategic projects and challenge the hegemony of the dollar. And this is where you start taking the move into a serious new area, right? So I've talked to you before about how what's it called? There's a phrase. It was it's not outrageous, but I'm going to use the word outrageous because I can't think what it is, but it's something like outrageous privilege. So the US is outrageously privileged because the dollar is the currency for international trade. And as long as it's a currency for international trade, the US can work at tremendous deficits, and it can rely on lots of its own yield bonds and gilt treasuries and whatnot. And there is just all sorts of benefit that the US gets by having the dollar as the currency of international trade. I talked you through like a whole bunch of them in a previous video. Right? It is really advantageous for the US to have that, which is why BRICS came about. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Now there's a dozen countries plus. And I said to you a couple of years back that a lot of people dismiss BRICS and they say it's never going to happen. It's never going to happen. Oh, BRICS is a joke. Why do you worry about BRICS? There's nothing to worry about. And I was like, yeah, but it is gaining momentum. It's gaining more nations. And one of the things about BRICS is an alternative to the dollar hegemony, right? That supreme power of the dollar. That's what BRICS wants, to replace the dollar with other currencies. Lo and behold, that is what is happening at the moment. So the dollar is at the kind of, was it not like at 60% down to 40% or whatever? It is not this privileged position that it was. And it's not just BRICS that is working towards that, because now we've got the French president talking about how there should be a challenge to the hegemony of the dollar. And if we have euro bonds, so we have transactions, the euro is a stable currency. It's actually, you look at, some people slag off the euro, but if you look at the euro's performance over the last bunch of years, the countries in Europe that are using the euro are doing better than the countries in Europe that aren't using the euro. And actually, you could argue that it is becoming a more prevalent currency for stability and international transactions. And then you've got the yuan, then you've got the yen, then you've got the pound sterling. Quote, the global market is increasingly afraid of the American dollar. It's looking for alternatives. Let's offer it European debt, he is saying. So this is essentially Europe, or at least France here, suggesting that the same outcome as BRICS. French president backs a new EU joint borrowing plan to fund strategic investments and, quote, take on the hegemony of the dollar. He warns Europe not to give in to the cowardly relief after recent crises, calling for long-term strategic action. This is big stuff, right? This is a world-changing environment we're in. Like, there's been this inflection point, and Europe is distancing itself from the US in really quite significant ways. Macron calls for the Eurobonds as a way to tackle America's hegemony. Quote, the EU is under-indebted compared with the United States and China. So what Macron is saying is, like, we don't have as much debt as China and the US, and actually we can raise money for ourselves by having all these bonds, and plus it means that the euro will be more prominent than a dollar. We should be buying our own debt rather than buying American debt. So we can maybe it would involve like getting rid of a load of American treasuries, which would then make it more expensive for the US to borrow after that, and it destabilizes the dollar even further. The dollar's already going down at the moment, and so there are loads of dimensions to this. Anyway, to continue his quote, in a moment of a technological investment race, failing to use this borrowing capacity is a profound mistake. So do you then add this together with cloud AI, cloud storage, EU tech? And this is where the UK is just out on our own, because the EU is going to get together with all its EU states and say, let's invest in our own tech. Let's get loads of Euro bonds. Let's borrow loads. We're doing that in the defense sector at the moment with the safe procurement mechanism. If we do that with our tech domain, our tech sector, then not only does the euro become more prevalent, but also European tech can then compete with American tech, because we need vast amounts of investment. Now, in case you're wondering whether this is worrying the Americans, listen to Marco Rubio not talk about the EU, but talk about Brazil. But he's very aware of the precarious position of the dollar. Listen to Marco Rubio.
Today, Brazil, in our hemisphere, largest country in the Western Hemisphere south of us, cut a trade deal with China. They're going to, from now on, do trade in their own currencies, get right around the dollar. They're creating a secondary economy in the world, totally independent of the United States. We won't have to talk about sanctions in 5 years, because there'll be so many countries transacting in currencies other than the dollar that we won't have the ability to sanction them. Today.
Now, that is a very, very big ramification to this. So if you transact in dollars, then the United States has the ability, and this is part of that privilege, the ability to sanction nations. Now, we can sanction Russia because we can sanction dollar transactions, euro transactions, and pound sterlings. And then when you have Canadians and Japanese getting together and Australians, we can work together on that. But essentially, the US holds most of that power because of the financial institutions like the SWIFT currency exchange mechanisms and so on and so forth, payment mechanisms. It's all about the dollar, right? But if the dollar is replaced by all these other currencies as the international currency of choice, by lots of currencies, then you can kiss goodbye to the US being able to sanction other nations. And that is a really important piece of leverage that the Americans have. And Marco Rubio is right to be wary. And now this is about BRICS. This is Brazil doing that work with China, right? Doing that trade with China in other currencies. They're not doing exchanges. They're not doing trade in dollars. Oh dear, this is a problem. Yes, it is. It is definitely an issue. Okay, we are now going to get off that, but I think that is a super, super important thing to discuss, and we'll come back to that. Right, JD Vance was booed in the Winter Olympics in Milan. NBC didn't show it. They kind of minimized the sound of it. Anyway, it's all quite controversial because they look like there's some American censorship of that. But asked about JD Vance getting booed in Milan, EU top diplomat Kaja Kallas tells us, quote, we've heard of a lot of not so nice words regarding Europe. So this builds on to this. Although we're moving off from talking about the dollar, this is still the idea that, Trump is taking the mickey out of Europe. Europe is responding. Europe is distancing itself from the US, and wants to get more independent, to leave US dependency behind. And then you had JD Vance talking at Munich Security Conference last year, slagging off Europe. Kaja Kallas says, we've heard a lot of not so nice words regarding Europe. Our public also has pride, European pride. It shows. So she's saying the booing at the Winter Olympics in Milan by the crowd, by the 65,000 strong crowd in that, is it the San Siro stadium, was an outpouring of European pride. Interesting way of framing that. Now, fascinating. I'm just throwing this in. I don't know if you've seen this video. Really, really interesting. This is a video of JD Vance's motorcade leaving Milan. Right, so where JD Vance went over from the United States to Milan to be at that stadium, and the motorcade is a full 40 cars long, big cars, armored cars, all sorts of stuff. So JD Vance went to meet Meloni in Milan in a 40-car motorcade full of Suburbans through the tiny streets of Milan, right? And then you can see Meloni casually walking out with just her security detail. So the difference is absolutely incredible. You've got a 4.5-minute video of 40 vehicles coming out, these huge vehicles, some of them like armored trucks, right? 40 vehicles going down the road, and then Meloni just walks out here with a team of just a few people. And she's like, she's the prime minister of that country. Yeah, there we go. Anyway, just having a walk out afterwards after a motorcade of 40 vehicles. Anyway, it's interesting to note that there's some more serious stuff there. Some Scandinavian PMs bike to work or take the subway. The Romanian and Moldovan presidents just go by regular commercial flights. More or less the same goes for most European heads of state. JD Vance had 14 planes to fly that motorcade to Milan and his security detail to Italy. 14 planes on top of doing all this to just get booed in person by every European president. He pretty much blocked traffic throughout Milan and nearly made a US athlete miss the Olympics because you couldn't get to the Olympics because of the motorcade. But that apparently cost, was it $10 million? Yeah, it cost us over $10 million to send JD Vance and his family to the Olympics. That would pay for a lot of school lunches. So the United States taxpayer, if you're a US taxpayer, you have just helped pay $10 million for him to take 40 vehicles on 14 planes to Milan to just drive around Milan, where Giorgia Meloni's just trotting about on her own. Crazy. Anyway, another issue is the upcoming both World Cup in the United States and Mexico and Canada and the Olympics. And at the moment, there's been visa processing being stopped by the US in 75 countries, many of which are playing in the World Cup and, of course, the Olympics. It's been confirmed that the United States rules, so then it also been tightening the requirements if you go to the US as a tourist, you just get a tourist visa or to go into the US as a tourist. Those rules will still apply to people traveling for the FIFA World Cup. All people planning to attend will have to supply 5 years social media history, including email addresses to receive an ESTA visa. Please understand, not even the Nazi Party requested personal information of people attending the Olympics games that they hosted. This is a big problem, and I don't ever want to be lectured by a right-wing Republican MAGA type, as I have been before, about how Europe it has a problem with freedom of speech. I don't ever want to be lectured again by someone that, JD Vance coming to the Munich Security Conference and lecturing us on freedom of speech when you're having 5 years of social media, investigated with looked at with a fine-tooth comb. Just absolutely outrageous. Here is a list of the personal data you now need to share to enter the US. Otherwise, you may need to go home at your expense. Social media accounts, last 5 years. Email addresses, last 10 years. Biometrics, face, DNA, iris, fingerprint. IP addresses and metadata from photos posted. Metadata on your photos. Family member names, parents, spouse, siblings, children. Family member telephone numbers used last 5 years, family member dates of birth, family member places of birth, family member residencies, business telephone numbers last 5 years, business email addresses last 10 years. And this is for ESTA visas. This isn't for places like Sudan and freaking Somalia, right? This is from many Western nations like the UK and Germany, right? That is what you have to provide. It is absolutely incredible. Anyway, I just want to talk, and we're going to go back to talk a little bit about, to finish this video off, a little bit about the $12 trillion deal, the Dmitriev package that Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are trying to do with the Russians. This is the rest of politics US with Katty Kay, but not anti-Scaramucci. And this particular one, they've got an intelligence expert. Except you can't see it because I pressed the wrong button.
Out global grift. This is a story that I feel that everybody has really not covered enough. The amount of money that Trump and allies of Trump are making at the moment out of this administration, and also this kind of blurring of national security and finances, and whether that undermines national security. And I really wanted to speak to you about this whole subject, David, today, and get your take on how the kind of intelligence community is feeling about all of this. But what has prompted us to do this now is that there are a couple of stories, really well reported stories, which I'd recommend people reading, that have actually come out of the Wall Street Journal, who are going after this harder than anybody else. One was about Ukraine and President Zelensky saying that Russia and the United States are discussing bilateral economic agreements that are worth approximately $12 trillion in exchange for a deal, Zelensky is suggesting, that would hamper Ukraine's prospects and favor Russia's prospects. And in return, the Russians will give the Americans a whole load of business deals. I'd actually heard from somebody who is very plugged into the whole Russian business community and the Russian opposition that he thought it was something like 20 trillion and that quite a lot of this would go directly to Trump and to Trump's allies and family. That is not what the Wall Street Journal or Zelensky are suggesting, but clearly there is a kind of a money for land issue going on here. But then there's also this other story which ties into this from the Wall Street Journal, which is about how much money directly Trump family members, the next generation of the Trump family, and Trump family acolytes and friends, Steve Witkoff's son, Zach, are making out of crypto and their business dealings with the Gulf states. And I think that you can kind of bring these two together under the general heading of grift and what this does to American national security. What do you make, first of all, I mean, let's kind of separate them a little bit. This Russia deal and what Zelensky is saying is behind actually these negotiations. What are you hearing on that?
Well, I think, just to set it up overall, when you take foreign policy classes, right, when you take international relations classes, you think about the interaction between governments as like driven by a set of national security interests that are assumed to be essentially the public good, right? Or how a set of leaders will perceive the public good. You kind of think about the world of these, sort of the US's relationship with Ukraine and Russia, or our relationship with the Gulf states. You think about it in those lenses, but I actually think what you have to do with this administration is think about a family connection with other families and the way that national security policy will enrich or create the potential to enrich particular networks of families and people. That is the better lens, I think, to view the way that we are prosecuting national security policy in a lot of different parts of the world. Because if you take a kind of what is the US interest with Russia and Ukraine, you're going to miss the fact that there's a network of people who are conducting that policy, who are quite obviously, and some of the facts that we'll talk about here, I think are quite striking, like who are driven mostly, not exclusively, but mostly by financial motive. When you hear what Zelensky is saying about this potential deal, right, or you hear what your contact had said, like, I think that is the better lens for thinking about the deal making here, truly.
My understanding is there isn't 12 trillion. You're looking at a GDP of 2 trillion or something. So there actually isn't necessarily 12 trillion. So I'm not sure who's going to buy this. It's been called the Dmitriev package. I don't know which negotiators on the US side would be naive enough to think that there was 12 trillion coming their way. But one thing I have heard is that the Ukrainians are relieved that Jared Kushner has come on board because they think he is less in that sort of having the wool pulled over his eyes by President Putin and President Putin's tantalizing offers than Steve Witkoff is. So are you thinking, when you say that there are negotiators on the American side who might be driven by material interests rather than by American national security interests, is it Steve Witkoff that you're thinking of?
The model here across kind of the Trump-Witkoff family has been that the the fathers are doing the actual statecraft, right? And the sons are profiting off of the statecraft, right? And I think the deal with the Emirates, with the UAE, is instructive on this point, because the essential mechanics of it are that prior to, and I think it gives us a potential window into how the administration could be thinking about a Russia-Ukraine deal, and how you sort of create the opportunity to profit from it. And by the way, in addition, I think the administration is probably hoping that if they can get a deal prior to the midterms, that gives them some political sort of wind in their sails, right? So I do think that there's a political motivation to the timing as well, to see if the Ukrainians can sort of have something crammed down their throats by summertime, so that the administration can count it as a win before the midterms.
We're kind of lumping the two together, the Ukraine-Russia stuff and the promise of Russian riches for American businesses, and then this UAE story and the crypto story with these Trump kids and Steve Witkoff's son, Zach. Are they exactly the same? Because in the Wall Street Journal's reporting on what Zelensky has said about this back channel deal, and what I was told in speaking to somebody when we were out at the World Economic Forum, actually, was that this was going to be money for the Trump family as well, and Trump family acolytes. But that actually isn't what the Wall Street Journal seems to be saying. They're just saying this is for American businesses, which seems to make it a little different perhaps than the UAE money.
It does. Yeah, I think insofar as we have the facts in front of us now, it absolutely.
So just the last bit, I'll let this play out, the last bit here. Where Katy K says, look, the UAE is definitely a family grift. Could it be that the Ukraine $12 trillion Dmitriev package is actually just for US companies and not a family grift? And he starts by saying, yeah, it looks that way, but on form, no, it won't be.
Is different because we don't have, I think in the UAE case, we had kind of a quid pro quo. It seems to be, right, that the Trump family got investment from an Emirati royal, and in exchange, the Emirates received essentially the end of restrictions on exporting advanced microchips, right? The timing suggests that that was the essence of the deal. We don't have that, you're right, on the Russia-Ukraine side. We don't have that set of facts yet. But I think given the way that the administration has sort of conducted foreign policy, and as sort of a kind of a vector for deal making, right, for the family and the Trump family and its associates, you would have to assume that some similar logic would be guiding a Russia-Ukraine deal. And to your point, I mean, there's not 12 trillion, right? That seems impossible, but there could be billions. And because the US has real leverage given the sanctions regime that we've instituted over the Russians, the opportunity for there to be a quid pro quo feels very much in place as you're trying to negotiate an end to the Ukraine conflict. And I think the way, if I'm, again, this is where it gets really kind of, I think to me, psychologically interesting, because I think that Trump and his family would say, look, our financial interests and the interests of the US in terms of its foreign policy, I think they would essentially say they're one and the same. Mm-hmm. It's all the same. What's good for us is good for the United States. And
that's something I've said before. Like, he just sees the United States as an extension of himself. Now, I'm going to bring this comment up. I disagree with this. People need to understand that Trump is just a symptom of a corrupted system that includes both Democrat and Republicans. There is no chance things will get better in 3 years. I disagree with this. While there are moneyed Democrat interests, and corporate Democrats, I think, will be somewhat susceptible to this kind of behavior, what you're seeing in this administration is categorically different to what you've ever seen before. And so I absolutely do. I would take issue with this doodle pimp, because this didn't happen under Biden. The Republicans were going mental over Biden lending 40 grand to his brother. The Republicans went mental over Hunter Biden selling a painting for, like, I don't know, 50 grand or something. You've had 500 million spondoolies coming from the UAE, dodgy crypto. It's just like, and that's just one deal. Like, honestly, it is just absolutely non-comparable. So no, this is not just Trump is not just another one of the usual crop. It didn't happen with Obama in this way. It didn't happen with Biden in this way. This is very much a Trump thing. The grifting is a Trump thing. He is a real estate mafioso mogul, and he's doing what he thinks a mafia king dong would do. So yeah, things will get better in 3 years. You can bet your bottom dollar there are going to be impeachments and there will be investigations. And you know, the rhetoric I'm hearing coming out of the Democrat side at the moment is you know, aligning with that kind of situation. Daryl Thomas, Putin's 20-year plan is working. Manchurian candidate in the US, UK out of Europe, US drawing out NATO, and Trump destroying the US from within. Geopolitics in our world is all manipulated by Russia. Blueprint is in the Epstein files. I don't disagree. I think, and thank you very much for your very great generosity, Daryl. I think this is exactly right. I think we'll look back on this time. It's going to be fascinating to see how much is by design, how much has just happened because Trump, for example, might be a useful idiot that's really easy to manipulate, and that Trump actually wants some of the same things as Putin. How much is this has been designed by Putin? You know, history will tell us, but functionally, it's kind of like the similar outcome, isn't it? So, yeah, at the moment, although Russia is getting screwed economically and demographically, you know, I think given a choice, Russia probably would have, if you could allow Russia to go back in time and not invade Ukraine, I reckon Russia would choose not to do so. But on the other hand, everything else that is happening in the world at the moment is to Russia and China's benefit. Everything. Like Trump is just handing them gift after gift. Thanks, Daryl. Thanks, Stephen, as well. Very kind indeed. So no one in a developed nation would accept a BRICS buck. Those countries are not stable. Yeah, but that's not the point, Steve. The point is euro more stable? Is the yen more stable? Actually, the yen's in a bit of an issue at the moment. Is the pound sterling more stable? And at the moment, the dollar is not stable. It's devaluing hugely. And in fact, there are some arguing that Trump wants to de-dollarize because he wants to cryptoize. So he wants to replace the dollar with crypto because, again, grift. And he's surrounded by, he doesn't understand crypto. He's kind of admitted that himself, but he says he's the biggest crypto guy out. It's interesting that you're advocating for something you don't understand by your own admission. The people that do understand, David Sachs, people around him who are huge crypto guys, they are pulling the strings, and the de-dollarization is about grifting again. And that hegemony shifts either to the euro or to the yen or to the yuan or to the sterling or to crypto. But either way, you are getting a change in hegemony there. And that is kind of what BRICS would want. So, yeah. Yes. Trump's Bolsonaro has the Trumpian Bolsonaro has been put in prison for decades. I mean, that's what happens when the judiciary actually do their job, right? Yes. And yeah, I really, because I do feel really bad about saying this kind of stuff over and over. But Americans in here, we know it's not your fault for what's coming. It is. Well, unless you voted for Trump, in which case, you know, I'll accept an apology on a postcard. But yeah, it is. This is the doing of, and what's interesting here, and I think the Epstein files shows us this, is that, you know, Trump said in Trump 1.0 he's going to drain the swamp. Trump has covered himself in the swamp. He's swimming in the swamp. He's wallowing in the swamp. He's lathering himself up on swamp weed, right? The Trump administration is the swamp. You know, if you're telling me, like, Trump 1.0 is all about getting rid of the political elites, but he's replacing it with billionaire, the oligarchy. This is where Bernie Sanders and AOC have it absolutely bang on. You know, you've got an oligarchy, you know, Peter Thiel and David Sachs and Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Sam Altman and the list is very long. Those are the people that are running the show in the Trump administration. And he's a guy that told us he was going to drain the swamp. That is more swampy than you could ever imagine. That swampy McSwampface. But yes, okay. Just seeing if there's anything else to add. Okay, yeah, please remember, we are still campaigning. We're almost there with the patch. Chris has been working on that. We've had a look at it today. We've almost got a patch ready for Car for Ukraine, but we are still campaign fundraising. So atpgeo.com/donate. Thank you, Ronnie, for doing that. Okay, let's just really come to the end of this. And the last thing I wanted to talk about was this NSA detecting foreign intelligence phone call from a person close to Trump. So I reported on this the other day, but it's been added to a little bit. So if you don't remember, there was a whistleblower that said, hang on, a foreign intelligence agency has contacted someone associated with the Trump administration. And that report went to Tulsi Gabbard as a director of national intelligence, and she shelved it. And she sent it to Susie Wiles, and then that was the end of that. So last spring, National Security Agency flagged an unusual phone call between two members of foreign intelligence who discussed a person close to Trump, according to a whistleblower's attorney who was briefed on details of the call. The highly sensitive communique, which was roiled Washington over the past week, has brought to the attention of Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard, but rather than allowing NSA officials to distribute the information further, Gabbard took a paper copy of the intelligence directly to the president's chief of staff, Susie Wiles. According to the whistleblower's attorney, Andrew Bakaj, one day after meeting Wiles, Gabbard told the NSA not to publish the intelligence report. Instead, she instructed NSA officials to transmit the highly classified details directly to her office, Bakaj said. Details of the exchange between Gabbard and the NSA were shared directly with The Guardian and have not been previously reported, nor has Wiles' receipt of the intelligence reports. Goes on to say later, he clarified his understanding of the complaint in a statement. The NSA picked up a phone call between two members of foreign intelligence involving someone close to the Trump White House. He said, the NSA does not monitor individuals without a reason. The person close to Trump is not understood to be an administration official or a special government employee, according to a person familiar with the matter. So who knows who it is, whether it's Steve Witkoff or whatever, somebody is involved. And I can't quite work out if this person was on the phone call or whether they have heard two intelligence officials from other countries or from somewhere speaking on a phone call. The NSA has listened in and found about this person. That was then understood. There's a whistleblower complaint that something needs to be done about this, and then that has been shelved by Tulsi Gabbard. Now, oops, sorry, I'm not even showing you this. So sorry, NSA detected foreign intelligence phone call about a person close to Trump. Whistleblower says that Tulsi Gabbard blocked the agency from sharing the report and delivered it to the White House chief of staff, where it promptly disappeared. Right. So someone in a Trump administration or someone associated with it is in some way compromised, and that's gone no further. Seth Abramson says, not sure how to read this anything other than Trump's handpicked director of national intelligence portraying America and doing so to protect Trump from revelation of the fact that his regime is secretly working with a hostile foreign intelligence agency. Jake Williams says, regardless of the details of the phone call, there's no question Gabbard broke the law here. Everyone involved in covering this up broke the law. The whistleblower is killing a career and honestly is risking their safety bringing this forward. It isn't nothing. So there's still something to be said about this. This has not been solved, and it is a real problem. Okay, and the final thing I'm going to say is just on the Epstein files. So this is a representative confirming that she saw an unredacted Epstein file that Trump never kicked Epstein out of Mar-a-Lago, as Trump said. So Trump caught lying, as according to the Epstein files.
So mostly today, I was just trying to go through a couple of documents that was particularly interested in finding out.
What were those?
One was related to whether or not Trump, had ever kicked Epstein out of Mar-a-Lago, as he claimed.
What'd you find?
It's not true.
It's a lie.
It's a lie.
Okay.
So Trump lying in the Epstein files. Who knew? But that is significant, right? So there's evidence he's lied, and then that should be, oh my goodness, he should be out. Karen Spennock is here saying, please watch 22 Minutes Greenland. It's hilarious, and we all need a good laugh. I don't know what that is, but I'll look it up. But in the meantime, Karen, just for you, let's just do a bit of baseball. Toronto Blue Jays, just giving you a bit of Canadian support there, Karen. So anyway, thank you very much for being a part of this live stream. I really appreciate your support for the channel. Thank you to all those super chatters, people like Daryl, people like Stephen Bendel, and people like Karen and Paul Gilbert, Jiri Krause. Really appreciate you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Very kind and very astute observations, and thank you for all the commenters. And even if I disagree with you, thank you for all those comments. They're really important to stimulate discussion here, and I might not be right either, so you could still be right. But I've only been wrong once, to be honest, and this is a known fact. I've been wrong once, and it's when I thought I made a mistake. So yeah, there is that. Anyway, thank you very much. Take care, everybody. I'm going to go and see my my partner, my other son. I had to stop a live stream yesterday because I forgot to take my twin number 1 to football. I've got twin number 2 who's got football today. It's Tuesday, isn't it? I should have taken him to football, but my partner's obviously taken him, which is why I heard the door slam earlier. So I'm probably in huge amounts of trouble for 2 days in a row, almost cocking out football training. But there you go. I am useless. But it wasn't a mistake. It definitely wasn't a mistake. I meant it that way. I'll tell you what, I am the most modest person in the world. I'm going to do a bit of biblical exegesis for you. So for those, for Christians out there who believe that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. So it's Mosaic authorship is this tradition that has been completely debunked now. But there's this idea that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, which included like the Exodus account, and it includes the story of his own death. So he wrote about his own death, which is a pretty amazing thing to do. But anyway, one of the arguments against Mosaic authorship is that within the writing of the story that he supposedly wrote, there's this idea that there's this claim that Moses is the most modest man in the world. Like, I can't remember the exact quote, but it's like, Moses, of course, was one of the most modest men in history, or whatever it was, which you would say fairly if you were writing it as a third person. But if you're Moses yourself writing the story, you're writing, and Moses, of course, was the most modest person in the world. And you're like, yeah, there is a certain irony of that. So either he's clearly not the most modest person in the world because he's written that, or indeed he didn't write it. So there you go. Yeah, rule number 1, JP is always right. Rule number 2, if JP is wrong, invoke rule number 1. This is all true. All of this is true. Take care, everybody. Big love. Speak to you soon. Toodle pips.